Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, the day British guns spoke louder than humanity. The British Empire committed numerous brutal massacres across India during their colonial rule. From north to south, east to west, thousands of Indians were slaughtered, tortured, or executed simply for demanding freedom, justice, or dignity. But among all these atrocities, one stands out, not just for its scale, but for the cold, calculated cruelty with which it was carried out. In this video, we take a deep look into one of the worst and most infamous massacres in Indian history, the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre of 1919. A peaceful protest, thousands of unarmed civilians, a single exit, and 1,650 rounds of bullets fired without mercy. To truly understand the horror of Jallianwala Bagh, we must understand the political tension and betrayal that led to it. The year was 1919, and India had just come out of World War I. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers had been recruited by the British to fight in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Many had died in the trenches of France and deserts of Mesopotamia. India had also supplied billions of rupees in taxes, raw materials, and food to support the British war effort. The Indian people had hoped that their massive contribution would be rewarded with self-governance or at least democratic reforms. British politicians had even hinted at it, giving the illusion that India would be granted more political freedom after the war. But that hope was crushed. The Rowlatt Act, a betrayal of trust. Instead of reforms, the British responded with repression. In March 1919, the Imperial Legislative Council passed the Rowlatt Act, officially called the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act. What did this act allow? It authorized the British to arrest anyone without a warrant. People could be detained indefinitely without trial. Trials, when held, were without a jury, and verdicts were often decided by British officers alone. Peaceful protests could be deemed seditious. It gave the government sweeping power to suppress dissent with no accountability. This law essentially suspended civil liberties and made every Indian a potential suspect. It was seen by Indian leaders as a complete betrayal of the promises made during the war. Mahatma Gandhi called it a black law and launched the nationwide Rowlatt Satyagraha, urging Indians to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. Why Punjab became a powder keg? Punjab, in particular, was under heavy scrutiny by the British. It had supplied the largest number of soldiers during the war. The British feared Punjab's martial spirit and believed that resistance here could quickly spiral into armed rebellion. The province had also seen a growing nationalist movement, with powerful orators and organizers like Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal gaining huge public support. In Amritsar, these leaders were organizing peaceful protests and educating the masses about their rights. They were not militants. They were lawyers, scholars, and voices of reason. But their rising influence alarmed the colonial government. On April 10, 1919, without any legal justification or public announcement, British authorities arrested and secretly deported Dr. Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal from Amritsar. This act enraged the local population. People saw it as not just an injustice, but as an attack on their right to speak, organize, and protest. That day, thousands marched to the Deputy Commissioner's residence, demanding to know the whereabouts of their leaders. The protest was peaceful, but the British responded with force. The crowd was fired upon near the railway station. Several people were killed on the spot. Violence broke out in parts of the city in response, with government buildings attacked and a few British civilians killed. The British now had their excuse. In the aftermath, the British declared martial law in Amritsar and brought in Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, a military officer known for his rigid discipline and disdain for Indian protests. Dyer was not interested in diffusing tensions or restoring peace. He wanted to crush dissent with brute force. He issued bizarre and humiliating orders. Indians were publicly flogged. Locals were forced to crawl on their stomachs on certain streets where British women had allegedly been attacked. Public gatherings were banned, and the city was under military lockdown. But none of these actions were publicly announced. Most citizens were unaware of these restrictions, especially rural families who had come into Amritsar for the Baisakhi festival on April 13th, a major harvest celebration. And so, unaware of what was coming, thousands gathered at Jallianwala Bagh, some to protest peacefully, some to listen to speeches, and many simply to celebrate Baisakhi. What happened next would stain the history of the British Empire forever. April 13th, 1919, a day that began in celebration, ended in unimaginable horror. It was Baisakhi, the Punjabi New Year, and one of the most sacred and joyful festivals in the region. Thousands of farmers, families, and pilgrims from surrounding villages had come to Amritsar to take part in the celebrations, visit the Golden Temple, and attend community fairs. But on that same day, a peaceful public meeting was also planned at Jallianwala Bagh, an open public ground surrounded by high brick walls, with only one narrow exit. Activists and citizens had gathered to protest peacefully against the Rowlatt Act and the arrests of Dr. Satyapal and Dr. Kichlu. They came unarmed. There were no weapons, no slogans of violence, just people sitting, listening, talking, men, women, and children. Brigadier General Reginald Edward Harry Dyer, now in command of Amritsar, was informed about the gathering at Jallianwala Bagh. He made no attempt to communicate with the organizers. He issued no warning, gave no orders to disperse. He took 90 soldiers, 25 of whom were Gurkhas armed with rifles and bayonets, and marched straight to the only entrance of the Bagh, blocking the only exit. He positioned his men in a tight formation, aimed at the densest parts of the crowd, and, without hesitation, gave the order, fire. The gunfire, 10 minutes of hell. What followed was 10 minutes of non-stop gunfire, the most horrific 10 minutes in Amritsar's history. 1,650 rounds were fired directly into the unarmed crowd. The soldiers were ordered to shoot to kill and to keep aiming at the largest clusters of people. People screamed, scattered, and tried to flee, but the only exit was blocked. Dozens jumped into the central well to escape the bullets. At least 120 bodies were later pulled out from it. Mothers clutched children. Families lay dead together. Young boys were gunned down where they stood. Eyewitnesses later described the ground as a field of blood and bodies, some twitching, others lifeless. There were no ambulances, no water, no medical help. Even those who were still alive were left to suffer through the night. General Dyer later admitted that he would have used machine guns had he been able to bring them into the garden. He also confessed, "I did it to produce a moral effect. I thought I could produce a feeling of terror and respect." The British government claimed 379 people died and about 1,200 were injured. But Indian accounts, including those from local officials and journalists, estimated well over 1,000 dead and more than 1,500 wounded. The real number may never be known because many bodies were secretly cremated without documentation. Families were afraid to report missing relatives out of fear of retribution. The British intentionally suppressed information about the scale of the massacre. Silencing the city. In the hours and days that followed, curfews were imposed. The wounded were left in the garden, denied medical attention, many bleeding to death overnight. Local volunteers tried to help, but were harassed and arrested. Amritsar became a city under siege. The massacre had sent a clear message. This was not a government, but an occupying force. Jallianwala Bagh was no longer a garden, it had become a graveyard. The blood had dried on the soil of Jallianwala Bagh, but the trauma had only begun to spread. As the sun rose on April 14, 1919, the people of Amritsar began to uncover the full scale of the massacre. Families searched for loved ones. Some found them lying lifeless. Others never found them at all. The city was in a state of shock and mourning, yet there was no condolence, no justice, and no apology from the British authorities. Instead, there was silence and a dangerous arrogance. Throughout the night of the massacre, wounded men and women cried out for help, but none came. No ambulances were sent. The British sealed off the area and forbade anyone from assisting the victims. People who tried to bring food or water to the wounded were threatened or arrested. By morning, the stench of blood and death filled the air, and hundreds of bodies still lay across the garden. Some survivors were discovered hours later, having passed out from blood loss or hiding among the corpses to stay alive. A local school teacher who visited the site later said, "The walls were riddled with bullet holes. The well was choked with bodies. It was not a garden anymore. It was a cemetery without graves. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer felt no remorse. In fact, he proudly claimed credit for the massacre. It was a merciful act. I was only trying to teach them a lesson. General Dyer, in his testimony to the Hunter Commission, when asked if he had considered giving a warning before opening fire, Dyer replied, "It was not my duty to give a warning. My duty was to punish them." Instead of being court-martialed or removed from service, Dyer was relieved of duty quietly but never punished. He returned to Britain, where he was hailed as a hero by many right-wing British politicians and newspapers. The Morning Post, a conservative British newspaper, raised a public fund for him. It collected over £26,000, equivalent to millions today, which was handed to Dyer as a token of appreciation for his actions in Amritsar. To many in Britain, Dyer had upheld the honor of the empire. To Indians, he became a symbol of its barbaric hypocrisy. Rabindranath Tagore's protest. India's response was immediate, emotional, and dignified. Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel Prize-winning poet and writer, renounced his knighthood in protest. Writing a powerful letter to the Viceroy of India, "The time has come when badges of honor make our shame glaring. The spirit of humanity has been sacrificed at the altar of brute force." His protest inspired many across the country to rethink their loyalty to the crown. Mahatma Gandhi's turning point. Until this point, Mahatma Gandhi had still hoped that India could achieve justice within the British system. But Jallianwala changed everything. He called the massacre the most appalling act in the history of modern government. Gandhi's faith in the British Empire was shattered. He moved from demanding constitutional reforms to demanding Purna Swaraj, complete independence. Jallianwala Bagh was the moment when millions of Indians stopped asking for freedom and began demanding it. The Hunter Commission, whitewashing the truth. Under public pressure, the British set up the Hunter Commission to investigate the massacre. The commission acknowledged the killings, but called them an error of judgment. It refused to take legal action against Dyer. Instead, Dyer was asked to resign quietly. There was no punishment, no accountability. Winston Churchill, then Secretary of State for War, condemned the massacre in Parliament, but even he opposed punishing Dyer, believing it would set a bad precedent for British officers. Thus, the official British response was denial, minimization, and a quiet cover-up. Legacy of injustice. Jallianwala Bagh was not an isolated incident. It was the most visible symptom of a system built on racial superiority and imperial dominance. The British refused to issue a formal apology for decades. Even during the massacre's 100-year anniversary in 2019, British Prime Minister Theresa May only called it a deeply shameful scar, carefully avoiding the word apology. The bullet holes in the walls of Jallianwala Bagh still remain today, a silent but permanent testimony of terror. How history tried to erase it. If Jallianwala Bagh was one of the most horrific acts of violence in modern history, it is also one of the most deliberately downplayed and forgotten, especially by the very empire that committed it. For decades, the British government tried to hide, distort, or justify what happened at Jallianwala Bagh. The goal wasn't just to escape blame, it was to ensure that generations in Britain, and even in India, would not know the full truth. The whitewash begins. The Hunter Commission. In response to outrage across India, the British were forced to launch an inquiry. The Hunter Commission, named after Lord William Hunter. But this commission was never intended to deliver justice. It was created to diffuse public anger and protect the British officers involved. General Dyer was questioned, but the tone was respectful, almost admiring. The commission accepted his actions were excessive, but stopped short of calling him a criminal. Dyer's only punishment was being relieved of duty without a court-martial or trial. No apology was issued, and no one else was held accountable. In fact, the commission split along racial lines. The Indian members condemned Dyer, but their opinions were dismissed in the final report, which largely defended the actions of the British. Far from being treated as a criminal, Dyer was celebrated in Britain. The Morning Post newspaper declared him the savior of the Punjab. A public fund was launched, collecting over £26,000 for Dyer, funded by British citizens who saw him as a hero. When Dyer died in 1927, he was buried with full military honors. No British government, not even after independence, formally condemned or apologized for what happened at Amritsar. Even when Winston Churchill gave a dramatic speech in Parliament condemning the massacre as monstrous, he too opposed Dyer's prosecution. Churchill's concern was not about justice, it was about maintaining the image of British fairness while shielding the system that enabled such brutality. British schoolbooks and silence. For most of the 20th century, British school textbooks either ignored Jallianwala Bagh completely or mentioned it in passing. It was rarely discussed in classrooms. When mentioned, it was described as a tragic misunderstanding or a difficult moment of empire, without acknowledging the scale or intention behind it. British students grew up knowing more about World War II and the American Revolution than about the atrocities committed in the name of the British Empire. In contrast, for Indian families, Jallianwala was etched into memory, a whispered horror passed down through generations, often outside school textbooks. The site itself was neglected. Even Jallianwala Bagh, the site of the massacre, was for many years left unmarked, unmanaged, and neglected. It wasn't until 1961, over 40 years later, that a memorial was built at the site. The bullet holes on the walls were never officially documented by the British, but were preserved by Indian curators after independence. In 2019, during the centenary commemoration, controversy erupted over the renovation of the site, which some historians felt sanitized the horror by turning the memorial into a tourist attraction. Even today, when colonial history is discussed globally, Jallianwala Bagh is barely mentioned. No major British university makes it a core part of imperial studies. Politicians avoid speaking about it during diplomatic visits. There has never been a formal state apology from the British monarch or prime minister, but this silence speaks volumes. Because what happened at Jallianwala Bagh was not just a mistake, it was a mirror that reflects the darkest face of empire. And so erasing it was not about forgetting, it was about hiding from that reflection. Why Jallianwala still matters. More than 100 years have passed since that horrific day in Amritsar. The blood has faded from the soil, the cries of the wounded have long been silenced, and General Dyer is now just a name in history. But Jallianwala Bagh is not just history. It is a symbol, a mirror held up to the face of colonialism, power, and injustice. And it matters more than ever today, because it exposes the true nature of empire. For decades, the British Empire was portrayed, especially in the West, as a force of civilization, law, and development. But Jallianwala Bagh strips that illusion bare. There were no rebels in that garden, no weapons, no threat. Just ordinary people exercising their right to gather and speak. The bullets were not fired in defense, they were fired to instill fear, a message that resistance, even peaceful, would be met with bloodshed. It reminds us that colonialism was not about progress. It was about control, dominance, and the belief that one race or nation had the right to rule over others. Jallianwala still matters because it changed the course of India's freedom struggle. Before Jallianwala, many Indian leaders still hoped for reforms under British rule. After Jallianwala, those illusions were shattered. Gandhi abandoned his loyalty to the empire and began advocating for Purna Swaraj, complete independence. Tagore gave up his knighthood, marking a cultural revolt against colonial honor. And millions of Indians, even those who had once stayed silent, began to see the truth. Freedom would never be given. It had to be taken. The massacre radicalized an entire generation and became a turning point in India's struggle for independence. Jallianwala Bagh is not just a chapter in Indian history, it is part of a global pattern, where governments use force to silence dissent, where peaceful protesters are labeled as threats, where historical crimes are hidden, denied, or justified by the powerful. Whether it's a protest suppressed by violence or a truth whitewashed by textbooks, Jallianwala echoes wherever injustice is masked as order. Jallianwala still matters because justice was never served. To this day, no formal apology has been issued by the British monarchy or parliament. The massacre has been minimized or omitted in global historical discourse, and General Dyer was never tried, never imprisoned, never held accountable. The world speaks often about justice, but Jallianwala Bagh is a reminder of justice denied, and of the power structures that still protect the perpetrators of historical crimes. Jallianwala still matters because we must never forget. The bullet holes still mark the walls of Jallianwala Bagh. They were not filled in, they were not painted over. They remain not as wounds but as witnesses. Witnesses to what happens when people are dehumanized, when power goes unchecked, when silence replaces truth. To forget Jallianwala is to say, it never happened. To forget is to allow it to happen again. Final thoughts. If you didn't know this history, now you do. And if you did, remember it and share it. Because these stories are not just India's history, they are the world's truth. This was just one of many atrocities committed under British rule in India. And in upcoming videos, we'll expose more massacres, famines, exploitation, and the resistance of India's forgotten heroes.